Thanks everybody for joining us today on KRTD News. I'm out of a different location today, but I'm still going to be doing the show. So we got some great topics for you guys today. We have the Fight for 15, issues with Rahm Emanuel there. We have the Amazon unionization, and then and the Paris Climate Agreement. So there's a couple updates on those things for you guys. So let's go ahead and get started with the first slide. So, yeah, we have Rahm Emanuel, who I believe, if I'm not mistaken, the mainstream media will cut you off if you try to criticize him before his hearing. We've seen some of those, Carrie, where they'll say, "Oh, we're losing the congressman."
Oh, absolutely. And I know Rahm very well from not just his time as mayor of Chicago, but prior to that, he has a very long political career and honestly has run as a Democrat every time, but has made no bones about his conservative roots, which you can see very well in this particular policy. So Rahm has surfaced again, and after his time in Chicago, he immediately signed on with a company by the name of Centerview Partners. They are I don't want to call them a vulture capital firm, but they tend to cater to really big businesses and those kind of lobbying efforts.
I can't hear you.
Can you hear me now?
Oh, I can hear you now. My connection cut
Okay.
out for a minute.
Okay. So yeah, he was just a member of Centerview Partners, and his time there is has been spent in lobbying for high dollar accounts, mergers and acquisitions. So it was really no surprise that he was invited to the Restaurant Association as a keynote speaker. We don't know if he's being paid or how much yet, but it's very telling that he was a policy advisor under several administrations, including the Obama administration. He is now still has an open door policy with the White House with the affiliations that he has. So he's representing an industry, not the employees, but the owners who are very much against raising the minimum wage. This is all despite what we've seen through Seattle, where Seattle, if you recall, several years ago, had done a graduated income rise for their employees in the restaurant industry in particular. So in Seattle, they've largely done away with the tip system and they've gone to more of the European, well, the model that is used around the rest of the world, where employees are paid a base wage. And what we're seeing is that in Seattle, you have more people who are able to support the local economy because they are now making what was at that time a livable wage. We can arguably say that $15 now is too little. We should actually be arguing and fighting for 25. But here you have Rahm making the news yet again, pushing back on the Biden administration and members of Congress for fighting for a livable wage across the country. And what's interesting about Rahm's position, what he's actually selling is a longstanding Republican compromise where they want to allow the states to opt out. The problem with that is when you have states opting out, like we had under ACA and other programs, they opt out. And what happens is the rest of the country has to pick up the burden left because those states have opted out. So consider, for example, what's happening in Georgia and other parts of the country. If they would opt out of a fight for 15, not only would you have a state like Georgia where they have not expanded ACA, Medicaid for their people, they have a really high threshold for their social services. And now you have them overtly suppressing wages. The rest of the country picks up the burden for Georgia. So somebody's always paying the cost. It just matters, whether it's on the front end, responsibly, proactively, or on the back end. So this is Rahm Emanuel, who is a champion of the third way Democrats, and I say that loosely. But the company that he works for now has been a key partner for Obama's reelection. And we saw this in 2011. So if anyone has any curiosity about when the Democratic Party started to move full force into conservative territory, you can go back before 2011. And groups like this one were largely responsible for everything that was happening policy-wise, to the point where even Obama, after his term ended, admits that he governed as a Republican conservative.
Oh, no, no, he's a 1980s moderate Republican, as he says himself.
He can say whatever he wants, I guess.
But he admitted it.
Yeah.
There was actually a speech where he said, I'm a 1980s Republican.
Yeah, yeah. So
he knows.
He knows. He knows. So it's just a matter of what do the rest of us need to figure out, and pretty quickly. And I think this is one of the things that we're seeing, particularly from the progressive side. Like you had mentioned, you can't criticize Rahm Emanuel. Well, you also can't criticize the squad either. Apparently, in some circles, that's considered divisive. And I think AOC herself called it violence.
No, you can criticize whoever you want. And a couple things from this. I'm seeing some people on the left make the wrong assessment when it comes to the minimum wage. Oh, for example, I just recently saw a post from The Intercept about who I used to regard as one of the more left-wing papers. Very disappointed with them as of late. They wrote an article saying Schumer says he's going to raise the minimum wage in the next budget reconciliation. And then Cenk Uygur at TYT gave them credit for that, citing the tweet from The Intercept saying, I actually believe he's going to do it this time. This is a problem I have. Some people on the left, you cannot give anybody credit until they've actually done it. Because when you go out and say, I actually, no. You need to go on your platform and you just say, I don't believe they're going to do it. Because they've shown you time and time again, they are not going to do it. You cannot assume they're going to do it. If Chuck Schumer does do this thing that he's talking about, I will give him all the credit in the world. But until he actually does something, I'm not giving that man a single piece of credit, because it's absolutely unacceptable to give him credit for something he hasn't done.
Oh, absolutely agreed. And these are the points that I think we're seeing all across social media, and I have personally made. I loved candidate AOC. I loved candidate Jayapal. I loved all of these people, and what they said really spoke to not just my situation, but the situation that I see in my community, my neighbors, right? I might be okay, but my neighbors not. And they were actually speaking to the things that we care about that will make our lives better and help ensure a future. But the politician version is completely different. And I am loath to see this kind of pushback. But I think the other thing that we're seeing come out of it is some of this pushback is coming from paid endorsements, right? Social media advisors, whether they have a large following or not. So now I have personally taken the tact of, when I see somebody making an emotional argument without foundation or, like you said, proof of action, my next question is, are you being paid for this? And I think that's a reasonable question, because I want to have some disclaimer, as we would for any other paid lobbyist or agent. You should be able to stand up and say, yeah, I'm being paid for this opinion. However, I think that's only fair.
Exactly. And then I actually think you got that one guy at TYT who actually was a lobbyist. I can't remember his name. And then they came out that he was a lobbyist, and he was posing as a progressive for years after he was a lobbyist. I can't remember his name right now.
Well, and this I think goes to the model of Fox News. Fox News in court has defended their positions as entertainment. TYT, while they like to pose as journalists, aren't adhering to the basic ethics of journalism. So, put it in its context. I'd like to see them say we're for entertainment only, or we're wholesale bought and paid for by the DNC, whichever way they want to go.
No, and I used to love TYT 2007, even in 2017 and 18, I still liked them. And look, sometimes they have a couple good takes now, but sometimes like when I see them giving credit to Chuck Schumer before he's done anything, you can't do that. And look, if they came out and they said, "Hey, we want Chuck Schumer to push the minimum wage. We're having a petition here," that would be a whole different story. And I would actually sign that petition. I have no problem with that. But if you come out and say, "I believe Chuck Schumer," I don't believe Chuck Schumer for a minute. I don't trust him as far as I can throw that guy.
Well, good point. So the proper response is based on what exactly? You believe him based on what? And it goes back to the old Peanuts cartoon with Lucy and the football, right? When you have Chuck out there making certain statements and then behind the scenes doing things completely opposite, based on what would you trust him to do this?
And as upset when people, even when I'm disappointed when people, when they do something I agree with, I'll support it. For example, TYT did their little petition for the $15 minimum wage. I pushed that. I supported it. I didn't know how far it would go, but because of what it was for, I did support it. But after that petition, and then also with the Intercept, Ryan Grim putting Chuck Schumer is going to do the minimum based on what? I want you to go back. Ryan Grim is not stupid. Ryan Grim is really smart. He can go back and he can read Chuck Schumer's record. He knows the Senate very well. And he absolutely knows that Chuck Schumer is not going to push the minimum wage and get that further. Ryan Grim is not an idiot. Ryan Grim is one of the smartest journalists. He was that there is. He can go and he can look at Chuck Schumer's record and he can make an assessment that Chuck Schumer is a liar.
Oh, true. And we're now starting to hear rumors about Ryan Grim too. Who's cashing checks, right? And under what, I have no knowledge that Ryan is being paid, but all of these things were starting to come out.
No,
and if we're going to be,
it's not necessarily Ryan, it's the Intercept there, because if you saw the Glenn Greenwald situation, there was an editor there who was a corporatist who did not want them to publish certain articles. And you have those people there. It's like some of the reporters at the Intercept are great, but they shouldn't be working at the Intercept.
Well, they still got to get paid too, so I'm not going to fault them for that. But you're right about the editorial staff, and it's something that we've seen. This is how it begins in the editorial room. So we've seen it in some of the larger publications, corporate-owned media. You have the editors in there who gatekeep stories and what they can and cannot do. So we saw this with Politico. Politico is now nothing but a propaganda site. And you're starting to see this with the Intercept too. So it's not just individuals, but it's also media outlets as well. So it all goes back to your original point about you can't be critical of Rahm Emanuel and or the Squad or any of these other things. So the big reminder here is when we were told emphatically that we had to vote for Biden and get rid of the Trump administration, we were also told that you will be able to push them left. With everyone, everyone has the understanding that they are not left at all.
The only way you would actually be able to push them left is if you made a deal, if Bernie or any of the ones who claim to be left, like Warren or Tulsi, made a deal before they endorsed Biden. Because before you endorse Biden, you have leverage. And you can say, Bernie could go and say, I want to be labor secretary. Warren could go and say, I want to be treasury secretary. Tulsi could say something, and they could say, listen, if you don't give us this, we're going to walk away and good luck winning the election. But they said, we'll endorse him and then we'll ask him for something. What did you think was going to happen? How are they enjoying their cabinet positions right now? All of these leftists and progressives and consumer advocates, how are they enjoying their cabinet positions after what they did?
Well, it's not just cabinet positions. If you recall, there were members of the Squad, AOC in particular, who said that she was behind the scenes negotiating for committee seats. How did that work out? Not so well.
Even get that.
Right. And all of that was part and parcel to negotiating for Medicare for all when they had the leverage over the vote for Pelosi. And that is where all the rhetoric and pushback came down, where, there was violence and other things that were coming out of it. So I think these are lessons for us when it comes to the fight for 15. This is a fight that is almost 15 years in the making back when $15 would have mattered, and now we're still arguing this point. What I do have hope in is there are states who are taking it upon themselves to rectify the issue at a state level. So it's happened here in New Mexico, and it's happening in other states. And hopefully that means that the Fed will follow in terms of Congress.
Now, this wouldn't be a problem if states all had a minimum wage that was livable, that we would not even be having this conversation right now. Or if the minimum wage continued to go up as it was, if one of those two things actually was a factor, we would not be having this conversation right now, and everything would be fine. Like, people libertarians all talk about the states each have individual issues. Well, the states could each individually evaluate what the living wage is and then set a minimum wage.
Oh, absolutely. And I brought up Seattle earlier as an example. And here is a location, a major metropolitan city, where we have concrete data and we can now look at it. And I know that, folks like Ram will say, well, the economists are all over the place. I'm not talking about economists or pundits. I'm looking at the raw data. One of the examples that came out of it, I thought, was a beautiful redistribution of assets and the employee wages. This company, very large company in Seattle, local, they decided that their model was unsustainable. They were going to be bankrupt in 7 years. So what they decided to do was add a 20% service fee for diners, and then servers are paid a flat hourly wage. They can get tips on top of that. So now you have the servers who are making a livable wage, have the opportunity to enhance that through tips. So you have servers who are now, the data speaks for itself. They are earning anywhere from $30 to $45 an hour, depending on their performance and their night. And then the back end workers like dishwashers and other frontline cooks, they're still making $17 to $20 an hour. And all of that goes back into the local economy. So that is data that we can actually pull forward, not speculate.
The other thing is, the fact that the minimum wage has not raised in a while has actually changed people's opinions. If you go back and you look at Jesse Ventura's debate in 1990 when he was going to run for governor, they asked him, would he raise the minimum wage as governor? He said, no, I don't have to. The federal government is going to do it, and it's going to go up at a gradual pace. Because he actually believed that the government would do their job on the federal level, so he wouldn't have to do it on the state level. Since then, he's come out and changed his position because they didn't do it.
Well, look at legalization of recreational marijuana. We just legalized it here in New Mexico. New York is working on it. Right. So this is one of those areas where the states are going to lead the way. Unfortunately, you have to have a majority of states who are leading the way. Then it becomes a no-brainer for Congress and safe for them. Let's be honest about it. They're not going to do anything that jeopardizes their position and their reelection campaigns. So if their state has taken that position, then of course it's safe for them to go ahead and vote for it in Congress.
Exactly. And then the other thing is, you have people like, I believe in New York, we raised the minimum wage to $15 an hour, but I believe in some places it's in New York, it's still not 15 the way they did the law. So they kind of screwed us a little bit.
There's loopholes in there, particularly when it comes to the disabled. Disabled don't get a minimum wage rate. You can still pay somebody who is, classified as disabled, like me. I have a disability. I can legally be paid $3 an hour. That's a travesty. Not just for my situation, but for anyone else, especially people on fixed income. We're talking about veterans and things like that. But one of the points that I want to tie this all together when it comes to Rahm Emanuel and the National Restaurant Association, they actually are significant lobbyists as well as corporate donors to candidates. What I thought was interesting is they predominantly donate to Republicans, except for a couple of Democrats. And these names are going to be pretty telling for you. The first one is David Perdue. Second is Joni Ernst. And the third is Rodney Davis. Now, Rodney Davis might not make, that he might not tie in real well, but he actually co-sponsored legislation with Kyrsten Sinema out of Arizona. You remember the senator who made waves when she did the flourishing on the House of the Senate. Well, they actually had received almost $2 million in lobbying through the PAC, those candidates as well as the efforts. And one of the things that they did was the Restaurants Act of 2020. This was a Senate bill which Sinema and Davis co-sponsored, and it was supposed to grant the restaurants up to $10 million each, hold them harmless for layoffs. And this is kind of telling. If they were not able to or unwilling to rehire the employees that they laid off. So what they were essentially saying is, we will give $10 million to a restaurateur. So that's up to and including somebody big like Darden Restaurants, who owns all of Red Lobster and a number of other Olive Garden, things like that. They could get this, handout of millions and not be held accountable to rehire the employees that they laid off during the pandemic. So those are your Democrats that are siding with all of this.
Definitely. 2 points on this. One, Democrats, the only difference nowadays between Democrat and Republican are normally the social issues. And my second point is, I don't remember the guy's name, but there was a CEO who during the pandemic, he released a big majority of his employees, and he went on to the news and he said, "They're first to the unemployment line. Isn't this great? I did them all a favor."
Yeah, it really depends on your situation. So
I remembered the name of the lobbyist who works at TYT, Benjamin Dixon.
There you go, Benjamin Dixon. Thank you.
Never liked that guy.
Well, what we're seeing now, and this is very telling when it comes to late stage capitalism. So you had the pandemic relief go through, which did extend unemployment for some people. And what is happening in some areas is groups like Lyft and Uber are having trouble with drivers. Like here in Albuquerque, you cannot use Lyft or Uber at all. Drivers not logging in. So what does that say when people are making more money from their unemployment than one of these gig jobs? We were told it was the gig economy. Well, what does that say about those employers and those companies when they're not even paying enough to keep people on the road?
Definitely, yeah. And then when also you get to Lyft and Uber in New York, we actually had a problem right before the pandemic. This was never able to get resolved. But in New York City, we have the yellow taxi cab drivers, and they buy the medallions. They spend like $500,000 on that medallion. And right before the pandemic, the mayor was talking about a multi-million or possibly $1 billion bailout between the city and the state for these drivers because were losing money and they were losing ground. And pandemic hits, they completely stopped talking about that, and these guys are suffering.
Yeah, I mean, I'm always going to be in favor of a union cab driver, always, because it's better training. They've got safety training. They've been vetted, all of these things. Well, I applaud people trying to get their hustle on. Let's take a look at the root cause of why they have to do that. And this is where the fight for 15 really comes into play. There's always a cause and effect here.
Exactly. On this one, I'm very open. If anybody, like I said, I was disappointed with TYT, but when they pushed out that $15 minimum wage petition, I did support them on that. And anybody else who wants to join the fight on 15, there's room for everybody in this fight, because this is a fight that affects us all. And we absolutely have to get this passed, because once we get to 15, we got to go higher.
Absolutely, I agree.
So let's go on to the next topic. Where's the slide? I can't see it.
Oh, okay. I can see it. So this is the Alabama's Amazon union vote. And I was personally expecting and still holding out a little hope that we might hear how the preliminary vote went, but don't anybody get too excited, because we are already seeing legal action, and have been, from Amazon back in November and starting forward. So for those who aren't familiar, Amazon had filed multiple legal briefs to prevent this vote from going forward, and then fought to make sure that the vote could not be done through mail-in ballots. They were very concerned about what they wrote was, during this pandemic, you shouldn't have to rely on these sort of things. And the judge ruled against them because of their own argument. Certainly during a pandemic, a mail-in ballot should be acceptable, which was a big win for the unions and the employees as well. So what is happening now is, it is probably the best example of a strict vetting of an election that we have seen in such a public venue. So you have the employees who are voting, and everybody who casts a ballot is being checked against employee rosters. They've already found 4 employees who cast a ballot who are no longer employed by Amazon. So those get set aside. They're going to go through the entire list, regardless of how that person voted, just to make sure they, number one, are employed and have a right to vote. So for all of those people who were complaining about the 2020 election, here's your prime example of how things actually get done. So fully expect to see legal maneuvering even after the context of the vote comes out.
Definitely. And I've been paying pretty close attention, and also been noticing how politicians are acting during this one. They're obviously the ones who are definitely not in favor of it. You have Bernie actually going down there to speak at the rally. And then you have people, as fun as it is to fight on Twitter, you have people like Elizabeth Warren tweeting at Jeff Bezos, "I'm going to break up big tech if you don't let them unionize." He's not afraid of you when you do that. He doesn't really care.
No, and this was one of the things that we talked about this morning on DLF. The National Labor Relations Board is the mediator for this. They're a nationwide organization through the Fed. It comes out of the 14th Amendment and federal law sections that govern how these things work. So one of the points that we explored was, number one, you don't have to be a member of a union to organize a strike. And we saw this in Amazon. Early on in the pandemic, there were employees in Chicago and Seattle, Portland, Dallas, all over the country who were really upset because their employer was not doing even the basics to keep them safe. And they all said, well, not only are you putting us at risk, and it would spread like wildfire here, but then we're going to take it home to our families too. So you saw these organized strikes, and no union was present in any of that. Here now in Alabama, they are actually fighting to create a union, a legal organization representation. And what that does is, rather than you and a group of employees going it alone and facing retaliation and hoping, it took a year for the NLRB to issue a statement and force Chicago's Amazon to issue an apology. By that time, employees had already been written up, retaliation had happened, things like that. The union actually provides legal footing and their own army of lawyers who have been at this before. And that is the chief difference between an organization of employees and union membership. And that's what they're fighting for in Alabama right now.
This is one other reason we need to, if you're familiar with the Taft-Hartley Act, it's something we definitely need to repeal. People have hinted at it. I've heard Sanders, I've heard Markey, I've heard Warren, I've heard a couple others, but no one's actually tried to bring this up for a vote ever.
No, and it goes back to your point about pay more attention to what they actually do than what they say. Where's the legislation? Put pen to paper.
Because I've heard 5 senators specifically, like I mentioned, talk about this. We got to get rid of the Taft-Hartley Act. Okay, why don't you bring up some legislation tomorrow that says, you can all co-sign it, bring up some legislation and co-sign it and try to get rid of the Taft-Hartley Act. Okay.
Absolutely. It's one line. This law repeals Taft-Hartley Act. That's all it would take. They're not moving on it. There's no indication that they are moving on it. No plans to do so in any way, shape, or form. This is why I think you're seeing at the ground level swell for union membership. And I myself am a member of CWA's News Guild for just this reason. It provides a little bit of protections from organizing as well as resources and networking so that people can understand, like under the 14th Amendment and the NLRB Section 1, any employee can strike at any time. How many people don't know that? And then we saw evidence where Amazon was telling their own employees, you are not permitted to discuss organizing except through the channels that we approve. That's illegal. And without these provisions that are laid out in the federal law, how would employees know? They still have to pay their rent. They still have to provide for their families. So that kind of harassment is rampant in a lot of companies. I worked for a very, very large multinational corporation who was doing the same thing. When there was discussion about union organizing, you would see it now on all the screens and all the monitors and everywhere people had lunch, anti-union rhetoric. That's illegal. But how would you know unless you're getting all this information either from union membership or going out to the NLRB to educate yourself?
Definitely. Yeah. And the other thing, you can actually, when I'm pushing to get rid of the Taft-Hartley Act, I don't think it will pass. I think there's enough neoliberal corporatists in the Senate and enough conservative corporatists to block it. However, if you get, as I mentioned, 5 senators have talked about it. These 5 senators go to Chuck Schumer. Chuck Schumer is not going to move left, but he's easier to force to do something than Mitch McConnell would have been. So these 5 senators can go to Chuck Schumer and be like, you're going to bring this up for a vote. They can work on that. They can go on TV. They can attack him for it. And maybe he would bring it up for a vote because he's weak. And you bring it up for a vote, and then you see what the results are. And then you can go on TV and say, this will make every single person who votes for it look really good. And they can go and they can say, you know what, I voted for this. So I'm in favor of unions. I'm in favor of strengthening them. And then you could say, and then it could also help progressives run against people who didn't vote for it. For example, I only think it'll get 6 or 7 votes, to be honest. I don't know if it will get more, but then you could get progressives to run against, hey, that guy's not for strengthening unions. And that's a real strong line of attack.
True. And right now you have a really good selling point because you have Biden himself coming out in favor of union membership. So therein is your spokesperson, whether it's unwitting or not. And you're right. You can go to Pelosi and Schumer and say, we need to introduce this and do it now. Especially when you have this outright assault from various states about election rights and voting rights. Now would be a really good time to reverse the trend for workers themselves.
And progressives and consumer advocates and leftists need to learn how the Tea Party operated, because the Tea Party was on the right, but they were feared by the Republican Party. John Boehner hated them. He actually resigned because of these people. They hated Pelosi as much as they hated John Boehner.
Oh, I absolutely agree. But that was a group that understood how to use their influence, and you didn't have leadership within that group or the strongest voices telling everyone to be nice. You just didn't. And it goes back to, we cannot criticize anyone over policy or whatnot. And that's just utterly ridiculous, particularly with the situation we're in. Oh, by the way, the moratorium on evictions has formally ended. So, we had evictions going on all across this country for various reasons, and now it's just going to accelerate at a rapid pace. And you still have a record unemployment. We still don't have national health care. We just had to beg for crumbs, $1,400. So I'm a little perplexed to what the thought process is for Congress, unless they're actually investing in guillotines. I can't imagine what the logic is.
And I think that every progressive, every leftist, every consumer advocate, because all of them in Congress are infected with what Kyle Kulinski refers to as Washington brain, where you think everybody's your friend. You see these people every day. They tell you it's rude to insult your friends. They bring you coffee. A really nice relationship there. But they get it very quickly. I have two examples here. AOC, in her first year, she led a protest outside of Pelosi's office. That was great. But a few months later, she wasn't fighting as hard. And then the next example I actually have, believe it or not, is Elizabeth Warren. 10 years ago, she did the CFPB and she fought really hard for that. She fought a little bit her first year in Congress, and then she gave up. And then these people they think these people are their friends. You're not here to make friends. Nobody elected these people so they can go and make friends and hang out in these clubs. We elected them for a different reason.
Oh, I agree. And this is where we really need to reset. And as I explained to someone today, the difference between a celebrity and a representative, they're vastly different, right? I might personally admire somebody who is in the political spotlight, but that's not why they're there. They're there to be representatives for their constituents. And in the climate that we're in now, it may be your representative out of New York, but that person affects me intimately too, even though I'm not in part of that state. So I have a right to demand certain rights and actions on behalf of all of us. And that at its core is what progressivism was about, all of us.
No, and I know progressives who they said, can't name names, but someone I spoke to said the first campaign they ever donated to was Elizabeth Warren. And that was because of what she did with CFPB. And they were very disappointed after that. And you get the thing is, these people weaken. The longer you're in Congress, the more they can get to you, and the more they can say, you got to calm down. You're too radical. Calm down. Nobody wants to hear about that. And then AOC also, for example, firing some of her more activist advisors and putting in place people who are in theory progressive, but still more moderate and less activist than her advisors. So you get to this point where you don't want to insult your friends.
Well, there was this event that happened in between after AOC did her protest in Pelosi's office with the children, and this new version. If you recall, there were a couple of headlines where Pelosi had taken the squad, AOC in particular, and was screaming and yelling at them. If that's not workplace harassment, and I'm fairly certain there were some threats made, either policy-wise or other. So those events were happening to quell the speech of these representatives. And so it would probably be something like, any legislation that you propose, I will never bring it to the floor. Jayapal got her walkthrough of Medicare for All, and we were to celebrate the first ever committee hearing. Great, still didn't pass. So now when it's introduced again, it's got 7 committees that it's got to go through. And it's got the disclaimer at the end of it said that the speaker has the right and authority to set the schedule for each and every one of these.
Good.
So Pelosi herself has said that I decide if this thing ever sees the floor vote or if it ever sees any of these committee assignments. So far, it's still stalled. So all of these things are happening behind the scenes, and this is where they have lost their ability. As you said, the Tea Party would have gone right back to their base and said, this is what's happening, and I need your help, and I need you to help me apply pressure. And it worked. What is AOC doing? What is Jayapal doing? Calm down. Simmer down.
Exactly. And I only told, that's just the story I told, the issues I had said with 2 of them, and you one as well. There, beyond AOC and Elizabeth Warren, there are many others in there who have softened, have weakened, and who have abandoned what they actually came there to do. It doesn't matter if you're bought and sold. It doesn't matter. Look, it's great that you're not bought by corporate money. That's very nice, but that's not enough. You actually have to fight. And if you're not fighting, what we can send another progressive in there just the same. You're not going to stay there forever.
True. And I have often said that the biggest harm that has come from progressives who speak the language and then get elected and kind of temper everything that they do is, how will we recognize the next one, and would we believe them? somebody who is genuine and who is not there to get reelected, who is there to fight for during their entire 2 years. And if they get reelected, great. If not, they've done their job. So how will we recognize that candidate when they come up?
I actually want to give credit to somebody we had on the show, and I think you had them on your network as well, a guy, Dan Whitfield, if you're familiar with him. So I interviewed him a couple, I think last month, and we're having him on again, but I asked him 3 questions. I asked him, are you going to run a re-election campaign? And he said, no, I'm not going to run a re-election campaign. I asked him, will he acknowledge third parties that are running against him? And he said, yes. And the third question I asked him, if a Green, a Libertarian, PSA, or one of these other parties challenges you to a debate, will you accept? And he said, yes, I will accept.
That's wonderful. And I personally like Dan. I felt badly for him because in his prior race, there was a Democrat who had to drop out because of some campaign finance issues or some sort of fraud allegations. And that left Dan there as the progressive independent, looking to the Democrats to help him defeat Tom Cotton, and they were nowhere to be found, right? So it was a team loyalty over principle in that particular race, and Dan should have had all the support necessary to be in Congress right now.
Absolutely. And it's unfortunate that Dan never made it to Congress, but back to the Tea Party thing, that was actually one of the original names. Everybody familiar with the Justice Democrats, Kyle Jank, and I think 2 other people created it. There was 4 of them, right, if I'm not mistaken. And then the 4 of them, when they were coming up with names, one of the names that actually was mentioned was Left Tea Party. That was actually a name that was almost the name of the Justice Democrats. So they could have actually gone with that name. But if they're going to go with that name, they knew what the Left Tea Party was. These people who do this were in politics for a long time and they know about it. And this was the original intention of the Justice Democrats, was to be the Left Tea Party.
Yeah, that didn't happen.
They have not lived up to it.
No.
And then you also have people who say, and there are people I've actually had conversations with who say, if AOC, if Pramila Jayapal, if Warren theoretically believe in the right things, it's okay and they don't have to fight for it because it's good enough that they believe it. And when I hear people say things like that, I'm like, if they believe it, but they're not going to fight for it, I might as well have Chuck Schumer in there.
Oh, absolutely. And once again, I was in junior high too, and I had the band poster on my wall, just like everyone else. If you really need to have a poster of AOC or Jayapal or any of the squad up on your wall, great, do that. I have neighbors who are homeless and dying. I have all of these people across the country who don't have health care. We're in a pandemic. People cannot pay rent. And once again, evictions are going to happen all over the country. I don't have time to listen to somebody who's got an ego trip over a performance artist. I need somebody in Congress. All of us need somebody in Congress who's actually going to fight for it.
And this was legit and I got to see if I could find the message. I'll have to blur out the name, but one of the viewers, after I criticized Warren for not fighting, sent me a message that said, because in theory she believes in Medicare for all, and in theory she believes in these things, we can't challenge her. Because if we challenge her, we'll get somebody worse. It's something about if we challenge her, then she won't actually fight for it. We have to wait for her to be ready to fight for it, and then she'll fight for it once she's ready. Because if we criticize her, it won't move her.
There's a psychology to that is akin to an abused spouse or somebody who's been kidnapped. That is exactly what you're hearing from somebody who makes those kind of statements, that they are excusing their abuser in that case. So I am never going to cry for a millionaire, nor am I going to cry for someone in Congress who's making $190,000 a year, has a platinum level insurance plan, paid for by our government that we cannot buy even with cash in hand, that has a paid staff who can look up House procedure rules well in advance, much faster than I can. And I can tell you the PAYGO rule took me all of 60 seconds to find. So I really venture to say that this person making this statement either is completely ignorant of their own political system, doesn't understand how it works, or they themselves probably need to find some serious counseling. Because what is happening in Congress, particularly with this staff and these performative excuses, particularly on PAYGO and all of these other things, we can look these things up, we can read it, and we can see very clearly, blatantly, we are being lied to. And I don't care how popular that politician is. The truth remains the same. If you're going to stand up there and tell me that PAYGO is an impediment to a progressive policy like Medicare for All or Fight for 15 or any of these others, you are outright lying. And those are the facts.
But you see, in theory, they believe in the right things. Isn't that good enough for you?
No, that's performative, and that is somebody who is obviously doing okay, and they're not worried about someone else or their neighbors or everything else, knowing full well that they are just a paycheck away from the exact same situation. For example, everyone who is homeless right now, we expect that they're not working, they're on drugs or anything else, all of these things that we make up in our head to make us feel better. But the truth of the matter is, 44% of homeless people right now in this country are working. They just can't afford a home.
Actually, this brings me to something that I supported, believe it or not, by Cenk Uygur. He actually proposed we put Congress on minimum wage for a year and see what happens.
I think it should be a volunteer position. Full out volunteer. Why are we paying them? Give them a dorm room. We already finance their staff. Give them a travel voucher. No. This is, again, returning it to the representative position. So I know we're almost out of time, and I really want to get to this, this Paris Agreement piece of it, because it's again, I think, performative policy, and people really need to understand what's going on with this one. So if you recall, the former President Trump, and the administration removed the U.S. from the Paris Accord, and there was a great outcry, and Biden has since rejoined it. But let's take a look what's really going on here. The Paris Agreement had all of these European countries who were signed on to reduce their carbon footprint. Well, how and in what sectors? And one of the things that's come out this year in the public eye, it's been going on for years, is Europe right now, several European countries, Germany included, are ramping up their plastics manufacture programs. Now, here's what's interesting. You can manufacture plastics using hemp oil and have the same effect. It's cheaper, it's sustainable, and by the way, you can manufacture in such a way that that product has a biodegradable element over a certain period of time. They're opting not to go that route. What instead they're doing is they're using all of the fossil fuel industry, particularly fracking. Fracking right now, the cost of fracking is very low. That petrochemical price tag of $200 billion in projects is being funded by U.S. fracking. So on this particular graphic, I'd like to call out the smaller map at the top. Now, Shane, this is your house where you live. This is New York and New Jersey. All of those blue dots are fracking wells. Those are existing fracking wells that are going right now. Now, in terms of something like ACA, Obamacare, little known fact, this is where I became a whistleblower. If you live within 5 miles of one of these wells, you cannot get insurance at all, period. And the reason for that is the insurance companies got to opt out because they know something about your health and your family's risk that no one else is talking about.
Would that be in a Medicaid as well? Because in New York, we have Medicaid. Would you be able to get that as well?
It depends on how your state has negotiated the rates or the coverage. So when it comes to private for-profit companies, they don't have to write a policy anywhere, right? So if a state like New York says, okay, Mr. Insurance Company, you can come in and write policies for our people here, and you can do it at X, Y, and Z rates, stay within these limits, that company can say, okay, but we get to opt out in some cases. And I saw it in Maine, I saw it in Georgia, I saw it in Virginia, West Virginia, Utah, Illinois, and Texas were some of the big states where this was happening. And that's where I was personally privately licensed as a consultant. And that's where I discovered all of this was happening. So far, no reversal has happened. So I was in the Obama White House 2015 and made this very plain. So it's 2021. But I digress. So let's get back to the fracking piece of this. So it's cheap ethane gas, and it's all coming from the US, and it's prompted by the massive build out of the plastic productions in Texas, Louisiana, Western Pennsylvania. And oh, by the way, some of those people who are getting money from this industry, remember we talked about Christine Sinema and Davis? And there's a whole bunch of people in New York. So you have Cory Booker and a bunch of people from New York and New Jersey, Democrats, who are also getting donations from these same industries. So I thought it was very telling. So what was particularly troubling to me was you had during the Paris Agreement a number, I think it was 360 companies who had pledged to reduce all of their emissions. And when I went to look at those same companies compared to the European rollout of these big petroleum products, same companies. So while on one end they're pledging to reduce their CO2 emissions, when you do a deeper dive on it, what they're actually talking about is, well, maybe we're going to use some water reclamation, or maybe we're going to put some solar panels up, and we're going to reduce our fleet of vehicles to electric. But on the other end, they're doing these chemical programs, particularly in plastics manufacturing. It doesn't make any sense. This is part of the reason why the Paris Agreement by climate scientists has been null and void. They have pretty much failed us on this front, and it all goes back to corporate profiteering. So while we're celebrating the U.S. re-entering the Paris Agreement, let's not forget that the Paris Agreement was obsolete 10 years ago based on the numbers that were put out. So we need to do better. We need to do more, particularly when it comes to U.S. fracking.
But now Joe Biden is the president, and we have a Democrat and not Trump. So isn't everything going to be okay now?
No, we've ramped up fracking. You know, we're doing more. We're actually doing more. So this is the same administration who is supporting DAPL. So old boss, same as the new boss, same as the old boss. So that's kind of where we're at with this.
Absolutely. So yeah, nothing really has changed, if anything.
That was one of his campaign promises. Yeah. Yeah, that was. Yes. He said nothing would fundamentally change. So why are we surprised now? You know, kids in cages, fracking.
Wait. We got two changes. He has a different opinion on social issues, and actually, he's actually not that good on social issues either, if I remember correctly.
He's not.
And then he doesn't tweet all the time. And
he doesn't tweet all the time.
Really calmly. So actually, his speeches put me to sleep, to be honest. But
he makes us feel better. I guess he makes us feel better about the heinous things that we do.
But we'll push him left. No, but yeah. We're going to get the same environmental policies. We're going to get the same foreign policies, actually more aggressive foreign policies. I think that his Secretary of State is more of a warmonger than Trump's Secretary of State. So in some cases, we're getting downgrades.
Downgrades or outright continuations, particularly in Yemen and Syria. Those policies have remained the same. And for the foreseeable future, despite UN objections, despite genocide, and all of these reports coming out about how horrific the situation is in Yemen, we are still supporting that effort either militarily, monetarily, or with weapon sales. So,
but you know, but he's calm. He's a Democrat, and we have a woman of color as the VP. So isn't everything going to be great?
well, I guess if those are the things that you prefer to deflect towards and they help you sleep at night, sure. Yeah.
Definitely. So I think we've run out of time here, everybody. But yeah, come tune in next week when we have Madeline Hoffman co-hosting. Thanks, everybody.